Okay. As as Ivan already said, my name is João Maia. I am a sociologist working here in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in a private think tank, a private foundation called Getúlio Vargas Foundation. And my main areas of expertise, Ivan already told you, history of sociology, particular history of sociology in Latin America. And in the last 15 years or so, I've been working on different research topics related to Brazilian social thought and the history of sociology in Latin America and in other semi-peripheral areas. I analyzed topics such as the similarities and difference between sociologists working in Latin America and Southeast Asia, the debates between objectivity, the debates about objectivity and political engagement during the Cultural Cold War in Latin America, the networks between North American sociologists and Latin American sociologists in the 60s and 70s. And a common thread that runs across all this research is the center-periphery structure and its effects on sociological ideas and practice. And I decided to work harder on this theoretical point and try to outline a model to understand these effects. And today presentation is about that. So I'm interested in things such as what does it mean to say that a sociology object is peripheral or a sociologist is peripheral? And is it possible to be creative while being peripheral? Is it possible to produce a scientific innovation in the peripheries? And how do we, us as interpret analysts can explain this innovation and this creativity. So this is the summary of my presentation today. I have this one big question, which is how to connect macrostructural variables such as the center-periphery division to the explanation of concrete intellectual practice in the semi-peripheries. This is a very difficult question, and I try to present my answer to this. I have three sections for my presentation. In the first part, I will discuss the concept of periphery in Latin American intellectual traditions, and also highlighting important contributions from the 60s and 70s, but also current contributions. I will also debate scholarship on the geopolitics of knowledge production in the social science, and I guess this would be somewhat iterative. You've already heard Pablo Kreimer talking, Fernanda Veiga, and all these scholars who are doing this work. In the second part of my talk, I will outline three main dimensions of this model of peripheral effects. And I will try to build on two major theoretical contributions to advance such a model. One is the idea of collective subjectivities, and I'll talk a lot about that later, which is a concept by Brazilian sociologist Maurício Domingues, and also the concept of knowledge practice that comes from the sociology of social science, Charles Keim, Neil Gross, etc. In the third section, it's more an empirical section in which I present three case studies from my area, the history of sociology in Latin America, to apply the model and use it as a way to understand different forms of peripheral effects in the social science. Okay, so let's begin with this discussion about the periphery thesis and the idea of periphery in intellectual traditions. The two lives of the periphery thesis, because the concept of periphery was very popular among Latin American sociologists in the 60s and in the 70s, and somehow faded away in the 80s and 90s, and then we have a new life, as we call. And so I'll talk about the new life later. There is a long tradition in Latin America of using the concept of periphery to think about modernity and its developments in the continent. You know, there's no space here to reconstruct the full history, but I would just like to highlight a few points. First, a major important hub for developing theories about center-periphery relation was, of course, the Economic Commission in Latin America, the ECLA. We call here CEPAL, okay? In the works of figures such as Prebisch and Furtado. You are seeing the both then here. Celso Furtado from Brazil, Raul Prebisch from Argentina. The concept of periphery described the historical and unequal process of global capitalist formation, shaped by colonialism and its effects on the production of unequal patterns of international exchange. Okay, one of the great innovations of this thesis was to frame the underdevelopment not as a stage in a abstract model of modernization, but as a historical process which was modern since its inception. Okay, previous thesis about backwardness framed this kind of underdevelopment as a stage that all countries went through. And Furtado and Prebisch would say, no, 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 this underdevelopment is a particular historical formation, particular to the peripheral parts of the global capitalist formation. England was never underdeveloped in this sense. Okay, the concept later circulated in sociology and political science to describe models of development and patterns of modernization. So throughout the 60s and 70s, a significant number of Latin American sociologists employ the concept in their efforts to interpret, to understand the particularities of development in a region. This was not an endogenous process at all, because we had modernization thesis, we had the modernization theory coming from the US, and I will talk about that later as well. But there were also relevant cases of intellectual innovation using the concept of periphery to understand cases of development in Latin America. Dependence theories maybe were the most well-known uh, breakthroughs in social science coming from Latin America who were using the concept. And the dependentist schools, and I use the schools in plural, it's a vast camp with lots of controversies going on there. They were not talking about the same thing at all times, okay? But they were criticizing the shortcomings of the ECLA's theorization. They were pointing out the limits of nationalist ideologies. They were emphasizing global capitalism as the unity of analysis. Uh, some of them were saying that was impossible for a truly capitalist development to take place in Latin America. So only socialist revolutions could bring real development, etc., etc. Here you can see the famous book by Cardoso and Faleto, and also a very famous work in Brazil and in Latin America in the field of uh, cultural analysis. Ideias fora do lugar means ideas out of place. Okay, this was a major work in the early 70s by a Brazilian literary critic that was using the concept of periphery and some insights from dependence theory to understand literature in Brazil. So, you know, the periphery thesis was so popular that it spread to other areas such as literature, science studies, cultures. We had the thesis about peripheral science in the early 80s by Ebbe Vissuri. We have in the late 60s and early 70s some essays and studies about brain drain, scientific colonialism, and they were using the concept of periphery as well to analyze such macrostructural divisions that reproduce it asymmetrical patterns of collaboration between north, south, or in the case, centers and periphery. Okay, but then we have the critiques of the use of periphery. And these critiques would go on from, late 70s until like 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And here we have coming from different areas. In the case of intellectual history, and I'm pointing you to the book by Elias Pauti, who is a great intellectual historian from Argentina, who criticized the thesis by Schwartz about the ideas out of place. And he was saying, oh, it's interesting to use dependence theory, but literary scholars and people who are working with culture must be aware of the fact that we must explain textual mediations and linguistic forms, and periphery is such a macrostructural concept that fails to take into account textual dimensions, intellectual performance, so forth and so on. In the case of literature, we have works by Silviano Santiago, who is a major Brazilian critic, still alive. Pauta is alive as well. I'm not going to kill him in this presentation. And Santiago was saying things like, okay, we can use the concept of periphery, but we must be aware of the fact that we can't analyze literature in Latin America as a second-hand copy of central models. The problem with the thesis is that we always tend to analyze cultural products in the global peripheries as imitations of more developed forms in central literatures. And he was analyzing Latin American literature and say, this is not a second-hand imitation. This is real creative in the way that it criticizes and comments the forms employed by European authors, etc. And then, of course, in the case of history of science, on the science studies, a lot of criticism goes to the fact that using the concept of periphery is the same as applying some kind of diffusionist model by which you posit Western science as some kind of hegemon that is spread towards peripheries. And I believe you are familiar with the work of Raj, who emphasized the idea of circulation to take into account local process of knowledge production that can't be explained by this simple idea of exploitation, diffusionism, etc., etc. And, but then we have the second life of periphery thesis, the geopolitics of knowledge production. I won't spend too many time here because I believe you are all familiar with these authors and with their ideas, okay? But I just want to emphasize that most of these authors have his own contributions from dependence theory, and word system analysis as well from Nautilus time, but try to take into account former criticism. In the case of Wiebke Keim, for instance, she tries to use dependence theory as a model, but she tries to identify different dimensions of dependence, not taking the assumption, departing from the assumption that there is a general dependence that can explain everything, but you have material dependence, institutional social dependence, patterns of recognition and prestige, and they all are interwoven, but they are not the same dimension. In the case of Fernanda Bagel, for instance, a colleague from Argentina, she edited this very famous book here, The Politics of Academic Autonomy in Latin America, and she uses Bourdieusian theory, field theory, to analyze the creations of peripheral centers in Latin America. She says, of course, social science in Latin America emerged from an unequal pattern of global order, but somehow elite groups and intellectuals managed to create research centers that managed to conquer some degree of autonomy within the circuits of knowledge production. And we have to analyze center-periphery not as a zero-sum game, but as a relation that has mediators, transfers, and process of intellectual innovation in the global peripheries. Johann Heilbron, in the case of, it's interesting because Heilbron is not particular a guy who would be associated with this. He has a strong scholarship in the place of history of sociology in France and Dutch, etc. But he has some very important texts in which he uses this threefold structure to analyze global sociology, center, semi-periphery, and periphery. And also Medina, who also gave a talk here in the webinar, right? I watched it. And the thing about Medina is that I think he is one of the guys who come most close to analyze concrete intellectual practice uh, because he uses an ethnographical approach from the action network theory combining with the idea of center periphery. And he tries to understand how transnational networks are forged between center periphery and how uh, local scientists in Latin America employ central concepts from the center technical repertoires, but from very different purpose. Okay, so his thesis, center periphery knowledge production, was also a very important moment in the second life of the periphery thesis. We have other contributions as well. You know, my PowerPoint is basically a resume of your webinar because Pablo was with us last week. George Steinmetz gave a talk about marginality and domination. I watched it later. And I was expecting Pablo to talk about peripheral modernities, which is his book published in 2019, which is brilliant because he tries to carve a space for analysis, which is not the laboratory, Latourian laboratory, not the major macrostructural relation, but the institutional spaces where peripheral actors manage to produce some kind of innovation as well. In the case of Steinmetz, I think he is one of the most interesting ones in the history of sociology because he uses the Bourdieusian theory, but he's very aware of the fact that we need to employ textual tools to understand how a sociological text is performed. Okay, and he also used psychoanalysis to do that, to understand how sociological texts emerge in colonial situations. I think he provides a very interesting explanation, but I think there are some questions that still need to be addressed by all of us in the field of history of social science who are trying to use the macro structure of center-periphery to analyze concrete intellectual practice. First, how to connect the macrostructural condition to the practice of social science in the social peripheries, and not just to the works, because sometimes we tend to see research that focus on major work by major sociology, which is necessary and fine, but we have to understand that sociology is a practice that has to do with writing articles, supervising, teaching, lecturing, different forms of social practice that are not just encapsulating the idea of publishing a book. Okay, and how to compare these different practice and analyze the whys and hows. For instance, it's not enough to say that someone doing sociology in Brazil in the late 60s was a peripheral sociology. What does it mean? Because he was doing something that was very different from other colleagues in other cities of Brazil. Periphery can't be used as some kind of entity that spreads as a kind of spirit that possesses all kinds of agents who are located in some place. So it's not enough to focus on major sociological works. We must analyze knowledge practice and explain its effects in time and space. We also have to understand how the peripheral effects reproduce in time, because sometimes you can identify some major breakthrough in social sciences who are being creative and criticizing the Western science, but that failed to reproduce itself, for instance. Or in the other cases, you have schools of thought that manage to be to produce followers, etc., etc. Why that happened? That's a major case for the history of the social science. So here I would like to get into the discussion about the peripheral effects. Okay, first of all, why effects? I think it's useful because it allows us to grasp how the peripheral condition may produce diverse and unexpected outputs. So it's a concept that allows us to think about the link between macro structural condition, the things that people are doing, institutions are doing, etc., or not doing. Because I'm interested in understanding innovation, creativity, etc., but that doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes you just have reproduction of Western metropolitan imperial science, etc., etc., and not just innovation. So, but sometimes you have uh, agents connected to imperial powers who are promoting an agenda, but the result of these actions are unexpected as well. So we have different cases that must be explained. So the model draws on the geopolitics of knowledge production, on Latin American intellectual tradition as well, encourage contributions from the sociology of social knowledge and insights from sociological theory. It's a threefold model. I believe this is kind of out of fashion in sociology, the macro, meso, and micro level. I know it's that has a lot of epistemological problems about that, but I will follow this because one thing is the peripheral condition as a historical structural fact that must not only be identified, but also be explained. We also have collective mechanism through which this condition takes effects in space and time. Okay, so you have, for instance, the role of foreign foundations who are funding social science in Latin America during 10, 15, 20 years, and they are generating effects in how science is performed or made in our continent. But then we have also to analyze and explain the concrete scientific practice that are performed by locally situated agents, because we have foreign foundations, for instance, such Ford, Rockefeller, etc. But we also have real people writing, lecturing, producing, engaging, etc., etc. So we have all these different dimensions going on, and the model tries to take into account all these three dimensions. So the intellectual tool to do that. First, I would like to present you to the idea of collective subjectivities. Mauricio Domingues is a sociologist who is not from the sociology of science, who is a guy who is doing social theory in Brazil, which is difficult because, you know, Pablo Kreimer already told you, we always have to justify what we're doing in terms of geographics and situatedness. Someone in German does not have to justify that he or she is doing social theory because they are universal by definition. Okay, uh, but Domingues has been working in the last 20, 30 years on this idea of collective subjectivities. Okay, uh, and you know, we all we as scholars in about who study science and technology and history of social science, we all employ concepts such as epistemic cultures, epistemic tribes, invisible colleges, scientific community to describe different forms of collective arrangements in the world. All these concepts are useful, but they are radically different in terms of scope, in terms of mechanisms of action coordination, in terms of self-identity perceived, etc. For instance, we may say that an informal group of scholars working in a research project is a collective actor, okay? But we cannot ascribe the same properties to the whole scientific community and say that scientific community is a social actor who who thinks like a subject, okay? Sometimes we use concepts such as schools of thought as if they describe a cohesive group rather than a dispersed collective arrangement, etc. So Domingues was saying that the concept of collective subjectivity as a way to explain mechanisms of social life production that avoid these kinds of intentionalist traps, you know, as if all kinds of groups that you describe somehow are modeled or fashioned after like the concepts of identity in philosophy, etc., etc. And Domingues argued that a significant part of sociological vocabulary treated collective groups as entities endowed with patterns of subjectivity and intentionality. So people sometimes are talking about class, social class, as if social class are subjects, like they think, feel, act, etc. The concept of social collective subjectivities recognize that these arrangements are not mere aggregates of individuals, of course, but also uh, warn us to pay attention to the different levels of identity and centering. Okay, if we apply to this idea to the problem of scientific collectives, we see that concepts such as scientific community, schools of thought, can be understood as types of collective subjectivity that play a constitutive role in the reproduction of scientific life, but which produce very different effects, okay, that are not necessarily planned or intentional. Uh, as in the next section, I will use the concept of collective subjectivity to demonstrate this point. The concept of knowledge practice refer to a set of standardized and repeated actions that have been learned by agents as a way of solving problems, and which generate a repertoire or a set of tools. Okay, Keim, Gross, Lamont present the concept without explicit reference to the geopolitics of knowledge production, but it's possible to establish this connection. After all, knowledge practice in peripheral contexts sometimes often involve the appropriation of scientific techniques or repertoires developed in central contexts for radically different scientific situations. So these are the two main tools that I'm using to build the model. The collective subjectivity is useful for me because allow me to compare different forms of collective mechanisms that produce effects in time and space, networks, etc., etc. And the practice of knowledge is a concept that allows me to focus on the different things that actors are doing in the ground, for instance, writing, commenting, engaging in critical conversation with one's peer, etc. So now I'll move to the last part of my talk, and I guess I will use more of my assigned time to do that, to try to convince you that this is an interesting idea to understand this. So I have 3 case studies that exemplify different types of peripheral effects. First, one case study that allow us to explain how central theories that are created, for instance, in the US or during process of knowledge production in the global north, that are recreated during transnational circulation. Okay, this is one type of peripheral effects. That means that central peripheries relations sometimes produce unexpected outcomes in terms of reception and recreation of theories. The second type relates to theories that emerge from transnational exchange across centers and peripheries. This is a different type. I'm not talking about, for instance, modernization theory that being crafted in the 50s in the US and then circulate in Latin America and generate strange things. I'm talking about theories that only come to life through transnational exchanges between center and peripheral actors. And this is a very interesting effect because you don't have to assume that this is a symmetrical democratic egalitarian relation to understand the fact that sometimes even within unequal patterns of communication, something may come up that it can be explained only by this exchange. And third case of peripheral effect relates to sometimes you have radical theories that come that are produced in the global peripheries that challenge mainstream sociology. It's a much more extreme case of peripheral effects than the first one, for instance. And let me try to explain here with some case studies. Okay. First, the case of modernization theory. As you know, there is a huge scholarship about modernization theories, usually produced in the US as well, that regard modernization theory as an endogenous product of US social science in the 50s and 60s that was later exported, especially for Latin America, okay, with the money from State Department, money from Rockefeller Foundation, money for millions of dollars pour into research products to understand obstacles to development, obstacles to modernization in Latin America, etc., etc. Okay. Therefore, sociologists who were practicing modernization theories in Latin America in the 50s and 60s are usually seen as mimicking hegemonic theories and reinforcing intellectual imperialism. And sometimes that was the case, but not always. No? And to understand these effects, I put the model to test using the case of famous Gino Germani, who's the major chief of scientific school in Argentina. You are all maybe aware of him. Germani is a major figure in the history of sociology, widely considered one of the main chief of schools, along with Florestan Fernandes in Brazil, Pablo Casanova in Mexico, Fausto Porda in Colombia. I do not have room here to expand on his biography. I like to call your attention to the fact that due to the series of controversies in Argentine social science, Germani was widely seen as a kind of a figure associated with imperialist projects because he was a huge broker in transnational exchange. He secured a lot of grants from Rockefeller and other agents to produce the course of scientific sociology in Argentina in the late 50s and early 60s, etc. But there are lots of studies in recent decades that have contributed to a reassessment of this interpretation, highlighting the diversity of intellectual, editorial, and theoretical agendas by Germani. Okay, but let's see how it goes here. We have a central periphery structure that is very clear. Okay, social science in Argentina and in Latin America in the 50s and 60s emerged through transnational funding in most cases, the so-called scientific sociology. Agents such as Ford and Rockefeller were instrumental in doing that, but international organizations such as UNESCO were also important. And these always involved foreign money, foreign experts, the so-called attachés by UNESCO, for instance, or sending scholars from the US or from Norway or from France or from Germany to advise peripheral scholars how to produce social science, blah, 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 blah. Okay. Um, and Germany was in fact a guy who was benefiting from that. He secured grants from these agents and pursue his agenda using this grant, etc. So you have also the collective subjectivities. For instance, funding agents and Latin American scholars, sometimes they forge a network which was very stable. Funding agents were, of course, organization with a clear agenda, with plans, with budgets, etc. But sometimes the relations that they established with local scientists did not follow the script. Sometimes experts developed personal ties with local scholars and pursued their own agendas, etc., etc. So we have all kinds of arrangements that were being established. And of course, if you use this concept, you can identify different patterns of tidiness, of identity, of connections between center and peripheral scholars. You also had informal networks between US scholars and Latin American peers. You have all the other kinds of collective arrangements that reproduced modernization theories, for instance, publishing houses, editorial projects, etc., journals, etc. But you had all other kinds of collective subjectivities. You have regional networks, for instance. UNESCO launched the Latin America Center for Social Research in Rio de Janeiro in 1957-58. And this was a project that used money from UNESCO, followed the model of producing scientific capabilities in the peripheries using the knowledge of the experts, of the global experts who were sent to Rio de Janeiro to advise on how to build a modern journal, how to build a library, how to establish modern research, blah, blah. But at the same time, that generated local networks of scholars who were pursuing their own agendas, and they're using these structures to establish their own networks of regional scholars. You have regional gatherings in which these scholars who were employing concepts from modernization theory began to notice that many of that assumptions did not hold true. Okay, as you know, they were testing tools, they were testing concepts, and they were identifying problems like, well, this thing here that Parsons said in that book, maybe we can't use it this way. And new ideas began to emerge. So, for instance, here you have Política y Sociedade na época de transición, which Politics and Societies in a Transitional Era, major book by Germani, gathering articles from the late 50s and late 60s. And this is not a radical critique, of course, of modernization theory. It's not. It's within the framework of the sociology of development. But it's interesting because it does not purely mimics or reproduce things that Americans were doing. Because Germani was noticing, for instance, in his theorizations, that there was no convergence of the different dimensions of society through modernization, because that was a central tenet, central assumption of modernization theory. That once modernization took off, different dimensions like religion, culture, politics would converge into a single path that would lead to a modern society, secular, free market, etc., etc. And Germany noticed that there were different temporalities in Latin America, different dimensions, and even different political systems were emerging that did not replicate liberal order. So this is a typical case of central theories being recreated in peripheral areas through the process of circulation. So if one wants to understand and compare, you have to understand the collective mechanism that were producing the circulation, but also the concrete intellectual practice, because it's not enough to say, oh, that research is funded by uh, Carnegie or Rockefeller, etc. You must analyze the concrete intellectual practice, how the concepts are being used, okay? Where Germany was discussing his concept, with whom he was discussing, etc. What was he reading and how was he was reading that books, okay? Uh, and here you also have books by Costa Pinto. It's much lesser known that Germany, Costa Pinto was a major figure in the sociology, in Brazilian sociology. He was the first director of CLAPS, the Latin America Center for Research in Social Science, funded by UNESCO in the late 50s. And Costa Pinto as well followed a similar route. Okay, he was a guy who was very knowledgeable of the US sociology. He read a lot. He was doing sociology in a semi-periphery, but the more he practiced, the more he studied, the more he conducted his own research, the more he noticed that some of the hypotheses and concepts that he employed did not fit the historical reality that he was analyzing, which led him to create adjustments in the models of the sociology of development. So we can also add different cases to illustrate this type of peripheral effect, okay, which is not pure reproduction of theories developed in the US, for instance, but were adjustments or recreations in terms of few concepts, of few hypotheses, etc., but within the general framework of these theories. And we can also analyze how they connected with their peers in the US, how they connected with each other through each knowledge practice, etc., etc. And then we had a second example, and this guy here is Irving Horowitz. Not very well-known figure today, but he was the so-called, and I will emphasize so-called, heir of C. Wright Mills. You must know C. Wright Mills, the guy who wrote Sociological Imagination, a major US sociologist who died very early in 62. And he was a guy who was interested in the third world in Latin America, and he wrote about Cuba. You know, Wright Mills has have a very famous book about Cuba called Listen Yankee, Escucha Yankee, who was a major account about the Cuban Revolution, and he was in Rio de Janeiro for a conference in late 59. And Horowitz was a very interesting figure because he came from the US, he had a degree in Columbia, but he went to Argentina in the late 50s to teach in a temporary position, okay, in UBA, University of Buenos Aires, and he developed a strong interest in Argentina and Latin America. Up to this date, he died. More than 70 publications in either Spanish or Portuguese, and I guess that more than 20 were authored in Spanish. I mean, they were not translated. We'll say this guy was also sending articles to journals in Latin America, for instance. So he was interested in Latin America. And why he was interested in Latin America? Because he was pursuing a project of so-called critical sociology, following the steps of Wright Mills. And he was in the US in the early 60s, and he was denouncing uh, mainstream sociology. He was denouncing the excesses of professionalism in the US social science. He was denouncing the myth of objectivity and how it led social science in the US to work with the government, with the State Department, etc. So he was interested in radical sociology, and he established a long partnership with Latin American colleagues. Okay, so and Horowitz, I did a research project about him, about the his engagement with the Mexican scholar Pablo Casanova, Brazilian Luis Costa Pinto, Argentinian Gino Germani, all these guys I already mentioned, and a very famous editor in the social science in a region called Arnaldo Ercilla Reynal, who was a guy who was head leading Fundo de Cultura Económica, was a major publishing house in Mexico and Latin America, one of the first publishing houses in the world to translate Economy and Society by Weber, etc., etc. And then Reynal was the guy who founded Siglo XXI, so 21st century, major publishing house in Argentina. And At first glance, Horowitz was a typical case of an US expert who developed ties with Latin America, instrumental ties, to benefit from a kind of extractivism, you know, using Latin America for his own purpose. And in fact, that was the case at first because he benefited from the engagement with these Latin American colleagues. How was that? Because as you can see here, he published a book in 1966 called Three Words of Development, the Theory and Practice of International Stratification. And this book was a book about the third world and and geopolitical uh, crises and conflicts in the 60s. And Horowitz was trying to explain to the American audience what were the concerns of the third world, what were the conflicts that were driving third worldism, etc., etc. And the bill and the book depends very much on theories produced by third world scholars, Latin American scholars. They are quoted, etc., etc. So, but once I started to study the the correspondence between Horowitz and these guys, I noticed that we were seeing a different kind of thing going on because Germani, Costa Pinto, and Casanova were major figures in Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina. And they also were pursuing their own research agendas. So they engaged in a kind of relation mediated by letters. You know, we don't write letters anymore, but we as historians of social science know that they are a major source for intellectual conversation. Okay. And once you read the letters, you see that they were doing all kinds of different knowledge practice through letters. Horowitz, for instance, sent his manuscripts on social theory for Latin American scholars. He was not just saying that, oh, I wrote something about Argentina, please fact check if I spelled Perón right or wrong. He was saying, I'm writing something about social objectivity. Do you think it makes sense? And these guys would answer, no, it doesn't. You are wrong here, 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 or etc., etc. You haven't read Marx in the proper way. The conversations were at very high level and were not always about collecting facts, you know? So Latin American sociologists were criticizing the manuscripts, advising Horowitz, theorizing themselves about capitalist development and modernization. And sometimes they were the ones who stopped the correspondence, who left Horowitz in the code. For instance, Casanova in the late 60s were already becoming rector of UNAM, and he didn't have the time to reply to Horowitz. So he he sent a former student say, "Oh, you may write to my student here if you want to know more about Marxism in Latin America, etc." So these kinds of things were going on, and Horowitz was also an asset for them. Okay, because eventually papers by uh, papers by Casanova were translated. A book by Germani came out in the US in the late 70s, thanks to Horowitz, who wrote the preface. So this was a kind of a transnational exchange. Of course, not an equal one, not an egalitarian. Horowitz had the money, the prestige. He has access to a publishing house. He ran a publishing house. He was a broker to the US social science market. But at the same time, they were really exchanging ideas and not just exporting and importing. Okay, and then to finish my presentation, you have the last case. This is a more radical kind of peripheral effect. Perhaps you have heard about participatory action research, which is a concept very popularized in the early 70s by this collective of activist social movements, La Rusca in Colombia. And Orlando Fowles Borda was one of the figures who were more associated with this technique. The participatory action research is a kind of research that takes into account the agendas, the role, the the interests of the social movements and tries to break with the subject-object hierarchy. I will not go into further detail if they really can accomplish that, etc. There's a huge scholarship on that. I just want to call attention that was a major innovation in terms of social research with social movements that was done in Latin America in the early 70s by social scientists and activists, etc. So applying the model, we had a first centre-peripheral relations. We are talking about how sociology was institutionalized in Colombia. Similar story, okay? Foreign foundations playing a major role in pouring money, sending experts. An influential local figure, Germany in Argentina, in Colombia, Fausto Borda. He had, he, he He studied in the US with Lynn Smith from rural studies. So he had a US PhD and he used that in Colombia to leverage. So he had access to foreign foundations. He used that to bring people, bring money, build institutional capacities in Bogota, etc., etc. And he was in the beginning, a kind of a very traditional rural sociology. Okay, but as time goes on, okay, these collective subjects that were established in Colombia in the mid-60s, for instance, linking Falsbod, other sociologists, social movements, experts, began to produce local research on Colombia violence in the countryside, which was a major problem in Colombia since the mid-40s. And they started to use the social theory and the social methods that they knew, okay, and that they learned. But they started to uncover different things, and they started to notice that mainstream theories in the 60s were major concern with integration, stuff like that, and they were not seeing integration, they were seeing breakthroughs, they were seeing revolution, they were seeing unrest, and they developed new ideas about that and started to come up with new theories. Eventually, this uh, uh, turned into a more centered collective subject. For instance, La Rosca was a collective of people who were self-identifying as a group, which is different from a network, okay? And they were starting to intentionally building a new methodology, which would be called PAR, participatory action research. So PAR as a practice emerged of a process of radical critique. And you can see Orlando Falsborda authored this book, Ciência Própria e Colonialismo Intelectual, which translates something less endogenous science and intellectual colonialism. That was early 70s. So this is a different kind of peripheral effect that we've seen in case one. Okay, Germany was like adjusting models, recreating some aspects of theories, but this was a more radical case through which social science working in the semi-peripheries benefited from an unequal structure, central periphery structure, but somehow through unexpected process, because you know the foreign foundation that was putting money in the 50s, 60s in Colombia were not planning this. Okay, uh, um, uh, the outcome of this process was a more radical critique of hegemonic social science. So we have three cases, and we see here the central periphery structure, the collective mechanism through which social knowledge, scientific knowledge is circulated, and the social practice itself. In this case, this is a knowledge practice specifically called PAR. In other cases, we are talking about specific concepts of innovations in methods, etc., etc. So just to wrap up, it's not enough to identify a macrostructural condition. One must analyze how this condition may generate effects in scientific life. We must also explain the collective mechanism that enact peripheral effects. It's not enough to say, oh, but Brazilian sociology is peripheral. Okay, but what were the collective mechanisms through which this effect was taking place? And we can compare these effects and their distribution in time and space. What kind of intellectual peripheral innovations gain traction and were circulated and disseminated, such as participatory action research. Others were not, were very short-lived, etc. So first challenge, identify types of collective subjectivities for making comparison, establishing patterns. A second challenge, I not talked about that, is how do practice of intellectual creation in the peripheries may transform the structural condition itself? Is it possible to identify instances of this happening? Difficult, okay, because we're talking about a very solid geopolitical structure, etc., etc. But for now, it's enough. I guess I talk about 45 minutes or maybe more. Sorry about that, Ivan, and I'm open to questions. And sorry, English is not my first language, so sometimes I use it very weird constructions.
It's all fine. Thank you for your presentation. I will just stop the recording.